Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the live recording of our podcast, Making Tech Better, along with our launch party with our wonderful guest, Esther Derby. Before I hand over to our wonderful host, Clare Sudbery, one of our lead engineers here at MadeTech, I'm going to very briefly run through how today is going to work. First of all, it'll be once I'm done with housekeeping, it's going to be a 5-minute intro with Claire, followed by a 45-minute interview with Esther. There's going to be a 5-minute storytime segment, followed by a 5-minute making life better segment. Then we're going to wrap up after the interview with a 15-minute Q&A. So if you have any questions for Claire at all regarding the podcast, please add them to the Q&A function found in your toolbar. Once that's concluded, we'll be having a 10-minute break before our after party information via the WonderMe application in your browser. Now, once the interview is concluded, we will be sharing information about what we've got coming out soon, as well as how to access the after party. So stick around at the end to find out a little bit more. Last few notes. This session will be being recorded, and the subtitles are available. Information on how to access those will be put into the chat function a few times throughout the presentation, just in case you missed them on the way in. And without much further ado, I'm going to hand over to Claire. Claire, do you want to take it away?
Hello and welcome to Making Tech Better, MadeTech's fortnightly podcast bringing you content from all over the world on how to improve your software delivery. My name is Clare Sudbery, my pronouns are she and her, and I am a lead engineer with MadeTech. So it's Tuesday the 4th of May 2021 and I have Esther Derby here with me. Hello Esther.
Hi, thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure. So this is our live launch party episode. We've never done a live episode before, so bear with us. Why is it a launch party now? Well, because to be honest, 3 weeks ago, we were too busy launching to organise a party. We've got 5 episodes out already. This will actually be number 7 because between recording this and publishing it, there will be another episode published. The podcast has been going really well. We've had well over 1,000 episode downloads so far. Last time I looked, it was about 1,300. I actually have a bottle of fizz in the fridge downstairs to celebrate the launch. I'm not opening it until I've stopped needing to make sense though. Okay, so for MadeTech, improving software delivery is often as much about people and their behavior as it is about technology. And systems thinking is where the two come together. And this is where Esther Derby really excels. So I'm delighted she's agreed to be here with us today to talk about people and patterns. And Esther, I'm just going to very quickly do a really short bio for you. So okay. Esther is the author of 7 Rules for Positive Productive Change. She's the co-author of Behind Closed Doors, Secrets of Great Management. She's also the co-author of Agile Retrospectives, and she's got 4 decades of experience of leading, observing, and living organizational change. So hello again, Esther, because I said hello and then I said a load of stuff. I'm going to start with the same question that I always start with. Who in this industry are you inspired by?
That varies from day to day because various people do very inspiring things. I mean, I think in terms of purely tech, I'm inspired by G. Paw Hill and Ron Jeffries and Jessica Kerr, name a few.
Fantastic. We actually did interview Jessica, and I do have both Ron Jeffries and G. Paw Hill on my list of people I would like to interview. So hopefully we will also get to them. Okay, so when I've seen you talking about people and patterns, you often reference systems thinking. So let's start with that. What does systems thinking mean to you?
Well, I mean, there are systems where you can take everything apart and put everything back together. And then there are systems that are the product of the interaction of all the parts, complex adaptive systems. And I tend to live more in the space of complex adaptive systems. So systems where the interactions create something that may be not predictable from the component parts of it, like any system with humans in it.
Mm-hmm. And so when people talk about systems thinking, does that just literally mean thinking about complex adaptive systems?
Well, I think a lot of people associate it with Peter Senge, and I tend to associate it more with complexity thinking and looking more being more inspired by natural systems in the way I think about it.
Okay, so are you taking natural systems and then applying what you can learn about those to software systems?
Well, when you say software systems, if you mean the code, while I started my professional career as a programmer, I haven't written code for a long time. So I actually work with the human and structural parts of it. So I'm not so much looking at the systems of code, although they often reflect the human and structural systems that give rise to them.
Yeah, so you might be looking at a whole well, I suppose there's two ways of thinking about it. So you could be thinking of a system as representing an organization, for instance, like a business, or you could be talking about a system as being people and the needs that they have and the way that they interact with software in order to fulfill those needs or get things done. So it's the interactions of people with software in order to achieve a particular purpose. Would that
Well,
be
that's
reasonable?
certainly part of it, but there's always the part, the whole and the greater whole. So there's the way people are interacting with software, but there's also the way people are interacting with the policies of an organization and the way people are interacting with the reward systems of an organization, or the way people are separated into departments and relationships. These are all things for people who are in an organization that are contributing to patterns of interactions and patterns of results.
So and all of that could be described as complex adaptive systems. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about the complex adaptive bit. What do we mean by complex and what do we mean by adaptive?
Well, in complex systems, there is seldom direct causality. Things are massively intertwined and they interact with each other and they affect each other, and every change creates some sort of little change in the environment. They adapt to respond to a new challenge, whether it's an internal or an external challenge. They adapt as various things change. So just like in a forest system, if you plant a new type of plant community, it will subtly affect that environment. It may hold more moisture, it may create a little shade, which shifts the environment. So yeah, constantly adapting, constantly responding.
Yeah. And I think sometimes that's something that people don't necessarily take account of, is the way that in organizations, in teams, and the way when we interact with software, we are all changed by those interactions. And so you can't take an organization or a team and describe it as a static thing that always stays the same.
Although people would love for that to be true in many cases. I mean, if you think about the kind of mental model that many people have of an organization, it's very mechanistic, which is static and unchanging. And you just, you turn the crank and it produces a certain kind of result. So I think we have that in our legacy as sort of a mental model, and that leads to people desiring something that is very predictable, unchanging.
Yeah.
And then they also want adaptation when they want it, but not when they don't.
Yeah, good point. Yeah. It came up actually when I was talking to Jessica Kerr, you mentioned before. We were talking about teams and learning, and she used a lovely phrase, which is that one of the things that happens constantly within teams is that we're constantly producing the next versions of ourselves. And I really like that way of thinking about it. Okay, so for what we're talking about today is people and patterns, and we've touched on systems thinking, and I read an article by you about people and patterns, and one of the things that I was really struck by was 3 bits of terminology that you introduced: containers, differences, and exchanges.
Mm-hmm.
Do you mind telling us a bit about what they are?
Sure. Those terms come from Glenda Oyang's work in human systems dynamics,
Mhm.
and they reflect factors that are present in any system, any human system, and containers tend to hold focus. So you could think of this interview as a container. It's
Okay.
holding our focus right now. But I'm also in a room, which is a container. You could think about my state, which has some cultural differences from other parts of the country, as a sort of container. So they can be physical, they can be psychological, they can be organizational, so they tend to hold focus.
Okay.
And differences can exist within a container. If you have many people within a container, there's a lot of differences between individuals in my states, even though there are some cultural commonalities. But they also exist between containers.
Mm-hmm.
And they can be a source of creativity or a source of conflict.
Yeah.
Right. And they're neither good nor bad, right? They are,
Okay. Yeah.
and exchanges are meaningful transfers of knowledge, information, affiliation, affection, money, all, whatever transfers between people within a container or between containers. And it's a very, very interesting way to look at organizations.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, often when I'm seeing something puzzling, that gives me some clues as to what's going on. If I just sketch out some of the containers and some of the differences in them, that can often help me understand why people are behaving in the way they are. And you see it a lot in teams that are, in various different locations, right?
Yeah.
So people, like on the org chart, they're this nice little box that says team. But if you actually look at it from a container perspective, they may have, the container of one location, the container of another, container of a third, a reporting relationship that encompasses 2 of them as another container. Time zones can function as a container because they kind of focus the rhythm of your life. And if you look at it from that perspective, the team container, which only exists in that little box on the org chart, isn't strong enough to counteract the pull of these other different containers, location,
Okay.
time zone, language, culture, past affiliation, all of those things. So very often when someone says, well, this team just isn't acting like a team, I'll sketch out the containers and say, well, there's a lot of things pulling them apart. What's pulling them together? Because when you show all the containers, it very often is just crystal clear why things are not, why the pattern is what the pattern is.
Yeah. Okay. So the context of this is that, in the work that you do, is that you might get called into an organization who are, they might present you with something very concrete, like they might be saying, we never deliver our software on time, or we're having trouble managing our budgets or something. And then what you're going to do is try to analyze the containers, differences, and exchanges you can see within that organization to help them to find out why they might have problems. Would that be fair?
Well, so it depends on the kind of problem, the kind of tool I'll bring to, my kind of mental processing of what's going on. So, if it were budget, I might not use containers, differences, and exchanges. If it's teams or groups that aren't getting along very well or aren't functioning very well, I may look at that. But I may look at a value flow, right? I may just do something like a value stream or some other method of organizing thought and understanding observed reality to help. Like,
Mm.
if their cycle time is too long, I'm probably not going to start with containers, differences, exchanges. I might look at the value stream. I might look at what are all the factors that contribute to their cycle time being so long.
Okay.
But you have to have the right tool for the issue. And if you only have one, you're kind of stuck. But so a friend of mine, we were both working at the same client at the same time, and they had something like 40 teams spread across the Middle East and Europe and India and the West Coast and the East Coast of the US. And he just drew a big old container diagram that showed, where all the teams were located, and then what they were overlaid with that, what they were supposed to be working on together. And he just left that picture up, and managers would come in and look at it and say, what's that? And he'd explain, this team that's in India is working with this team on the West Coast and this other team, and they're supposed to deliver together, blah, blah, blah. Didn't tell people what to do, but over time they started shifting so that, teams were only 2 time zones apart, right? That were expected to deliver together. So it can explain certain patterns of behavior. It wouldn't be my first place to talk about budgeting issues, probably.
Okay. Yeah. And the way that you describe containers, I'm instantly picturing in my mind a Venn diagram, because it feels as though the idea of circles and shapes overlapping, so that you can see, some people belong to different sets of containers.
Yeah.
That there are different.
Yeah, that's a reasonable analogy for it.
Yeah. So can you give an example, just kind of sticking with the containers theme, can you give an example of either a real or a typical type of problem that you might think, okay, yeah, what I want to do at this point is draw a container diagram?
When there are issues in patterns of interaction is when I would probably use that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So another example was a group where, this team just wasn't getting along, and it was like, what can possibly be going wrong here? And I just drew a little diagram, which it started out being just, here's the floor layout, so here's like 8 of the people on the team in a team room, and here's one person around the corner and down the hall. So right there, they've got, a fractured container. And then I started looking at the differences on top of it, which was all of the guys in the team were men, and the person sitting down the hall was a woman, and they were all in a computer science background, and she had a different background, and they were in their 30s and she was close to 50. And so there was, I was looking at the differences too, but the differences and the containers kind of lined up to exacerbate that, amplify that difference. So she was just not, integrated into the team in any reasonable way for a whole bunch of reasons that were amplified by the way the containers existed and the way, they didn't have a chance to really get to know each other as people, right?
So it's interesting because in that example, the differences that you describe are clearly causing issues. That there's one group of people who are all quite closely aligned, and then there's one other person who's effectively just right on the edges of things, and there are a series of differences that cause that to happen. And in that case, the differences seem like they're effectively negative. But I was really interested earlier when you said difference doesn't have to be negative. Difference can be a good thing, diversity and creativity. So
it could have been in that case too, because she had a wealth of business knowledge and experience, and that difference could have been amplified to great benefit for everybody.
That was actually going to be my question. Are there times where you can kind of take differences, acknowledge that a negative impact that they're having, but turn that on its head and turn it into a positive by recognizing the value of diversity?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so here's another example of differences. So when I was a dev manager, I had a team that was part contractors and part employees.
Mm-hmm.
And I went to great lengths to dampen that difference,
Mm-hmm.
because I don't believe you can have a team with two classes of people.
Mm-hmm.
So, I treated everybody pretty much the same. And that dampened that difference.
Yeah.
However, we got a menu from on high one day saying that contractors could no longer be in certain kinds of meetings, that contractors you couldn't give contractors feedback, and that if there was a little birthday celebration or some other sort of celebration where the cake was paid for out of company petty cash, the contractors could not have cake. Which amplifies the difference.
Of course.
Right?
Yes.
It says you are a second class person here.
Yeah. No cake for you.
No cake for you. And of course, I ignored most of those because I was more interested in having a functioning team. And it was real clear that these people were contractors. I mean, it wasn't that we pretended they were employees, but I didn't treat them like they were a different class of humans.
Yeah, it's really, I've seen that one, from both sides,
Sure.
from being a permanent employee and from being one of the contractors. And it is a really common one that people tend to, use as a reason to treat people differently and to exclude people from things. And not appearing to realize that if you want a team to function well, then the people have to feel like they're a part of that team. They have to be able to relate to one another.
Not like they're second-class citizens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
So I think that's a really clear example of where, you can amplify that difference and you'll get one pattern of behavior where you'll get people who, may not be as engaged. They may not be interested in learning stuff, whatever. They're just writing their code and going home. If you amplify the difference, but if you dampen the difference, then you get a more cohesive group. You're more likely to have everybody learning.
Yeah.
And you're more likely to have everybody engaged in solving the problems.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to pause there. I have to confess, I'm childishly excited by the fact that I've actually managed to introduce music into a live podcast episode. But anyway, while I've got your attention, I want to tell you a little bit about Made Tech. So after 21 years in the industry, I'm quite choosy about who I'll work for. And so the reason I am working for Made Tech, there are many reasons. So we are software delivery experts with high technical standards. We work almost exclusively in the public sector, that is to say, not for profit. We have an open source employee handbook on GitHub, which I just really love. We have unlimited annual leave. But what I love most about Made Tech is the people and their passion to make a difference and the way that they really care for each other. Our Twitter handle is Made Tech. That's MADETECH. We have some free books available at madetech.com/resources/books. And we are currently recruiting in London, Bristol, South Wales, and the north of England via our Manchester office, all of which are in the UK. You can find out more about that if you go to madetech.com/careers. Okay, so we were talking about containers. We were talking about differences, and something.
But I have a question for you.
Yes,
because you just mentioned 5 containers. You have London, Bristol, South Wales, Manchester. Was it 4 or 5 that you mentioned?
It was 4, but I talked about the north of England via our Manchester.
Okay. Okay, so so there you have 4 containers, and a 5th one being the overall company. So how do you keep coherence across those different containers?
Well, and that is a great question. And what's really interesting is that the fact that for the past 12 months we have been all working remotely has actually made that easier in the global sense. So, you know, in terms of MedTech having one single identity and working cohesively across the boundaries of those regional containers, that's been a lot easier. In fact, you know, because we're all just sitting in front of our computers, and the fact that I'm talking to somebody who's in Manchester is mostly not meaningful to me, because they could be anywhere. And a lot of the time I realize I don't know where the people that I'm talking to are. So the big challenge has actually been, how do we maintain some kind of regional identity? And you might even ask, why do we want to? But, you know, the reason we do want to, there are definitely, there is definitely research about what makes a good size of team. And when you have larger numbers of people, I think we are somewhere between 150 and 200 people. I have lost track because we're growing quite fast across the whole country. But within the offices, they're much smaller groups of people. And it's easier in a smaller group of people to have some sense of identity and belonging. To then work effectively together, because you feel some allegiance and closeness, and you can build those relationships as well. So the challenge has been to have those regional identities and to encourage people to spend time with each other on a regional basis. And something that I've noticed about lockdown is persuading people to spend time with each other in order to bond and build trust is hard, because whatever you do, it involves sitting in front of a computer. And rather than saying, now we can leave this building and go to the pub, if we want people to spend time together, we have to make them sit in front of their computers again. And that's been quite a challenge. I don't know if you've had any experience of that.
Yeah, sure. The whole issue of containers, now that we're remote, is, you know, as you said, in some ways easier because, you know, the regional thing isn't so salient anymore. But what I have seen happen, and, you know, what I have fostered in many cases, is setting up virtual communities, not necessarily around work, but around something people care about. You know, so a hobby, like the people who smoke meat, or the people who brew beer, or the people who knit, or the people who quilt, you know, whatever it is, but just have some sanctioned internal community that allows people to knit across those boundaries. Now,
that's a really good point.
You're looking at trying to knit within a container, right? So you have that regional identity, and so if there's something you could think about that would be a regional project, you know, maybe it's a volunteer regional project, or, you know, something that allows people to form around that isn't necessarily work, that might help.
Yeah. Did you just say smoke meat? I don't think you meant.
I have friends who smoke meat. That's like their hobby.
I thought you were getting confused between people who smoke and people who eat meat. People who smoke meat? What?
And they smoke meat and then they eat it.
Wow. Oh, wait a minute. Oh, you mean like in a barbecue, like put it in a smokehouse.
Yeah.
You don't
no,
mean,
not
you
like,
don't mean
not
roll
like
it
this.
up into a cigarette.
No, not like that. Yeah. They have like these amazing smokers with like all these temperature sensors, and they care very carefully, follow the temperature of the meat, and there's a certain point where you have to do this.
Wow.
Yeah, it's fancy.
That's impressive.
And it tastes really great. Unfortunately, none of my friends who smoke meat live close to me.
Oh, okay.
Oh, it's very sad.
I don't know anybody who smokes meat either, but I can't get it out of my head now, the idea of somebody rolling it up into a cigarette.
Yeah, that's gross.
And then eating it.
That's gross.
It's gross.
No, don't do that.
Okay, so one of the things that I know that you're really interested in, which is related to this whole thing of containers and exchanges and differences, is identifying patterns. So how do you identify patterns in systems?
Well, so first I'll talk about what I mean by a pattern, and that's some event that has meaning that reoccurs over time or over space. Yeah. So sometimes you can observe them. Sometimes you look at data. You know, like if a company is complaining about our projects are always late, I may look at their data, you know, and say, well, let's see, of 47 projects, all of them have come in this late, and they share these characteristics. Usually they're too big.
Mm-hmm.
Or they're not doing adaptive planning or something. So data is a big place to find that kind of stuff. I mean, because we're all bombarded with events all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And that sort of modeling allows us to get a broader temporal view of what's going on, or a broader spatial view, because we may see what's going on within our own team or our own department, but we may not realize that this pattern replicates across many teams.
Yeah, and you mentioned value stream mapping before. I guess that would be a very good way of identifying, specific patterns. What do you, just for those that don't know, well, actually, you look like maybe you disagree with me. Anyway, I was going to say, tell me what you mean by value stream mapping, but you're maybe going to disagree with me that that's a way of identifying patterns.
It's not what I usually use it for.
Okay.
But it may lead me to say, oh, there are some patterns here that everybody who has a service level agreement, they wait until the day before to deliver. That would be a pattern that might show up in a value stream map.
So now I'm going to have to ask you to explain, what do you mean by a value stream map, so that we can kind of unpick that a little bit.
Well, it's the flow of value through an organization. So it shows what are the various things that need to happen, and where they happen, and how much time is spent waiting versus how much time is spent actually working on a task and identifying the handoffs.
Yeah.
So that kind of thing. Pretty standard.
Well, what I was thinking of is that if you do a value stream mapping exercise, what you might spot is that there are particular bottlenecks or particular delays in the system that are repeated and that keep happening. So I was imagining that might be one way of identifying a pattern.
So what's an example of a delay that you think would show up?
So, for instance, you might have a bottleneck around testing. So, for instance, if somebody has structured their process in such a way that they have a separate group of people responsible for testing, and that a piece of software will reach a particular point in the process and then gets handed off to this other group, and then everybody waits. And there's not much communication there. And there are quite a few things you might be able to do to smooth that over. You might be able to bring those groups of people closer together and have better communication, but you also might recognize that, and also you might say that rather than it being this kind of very separate point in the process, that you might actually bring it further forward, and you might let it happen in parallel rather than it being a kind of chuck it over the wall situation. Sure. But that's the kind of pattern that I was thinking of, that I could imagine you might identify. And you might see that happening across many teams if the whole organization is using that method of development. I
think that would definitely show up. That's generally not a situation that I would imagine using a value stream for, but I might see patterns of permissions, people waiting for permission. That's a really common delay. The service level agreement common delay is often a pattern across an organization where you hand this to us and our contract says we have to deliver it in 20 days, and even though it only takes 5 minutes, we wait until day 19 to do it. That's a huge source of delay. So
And what's really interesting, go on, sorry.
No, you go ahead. Go ahead.
What's interesting about patterns is that when you say that, you say, okay, so I might be helping an organization to identify how they might be able to improve, and what is the source of any problems that they are complaining about, and I'm going to look for patterns. And it sounds obvious. It's one of those things, you say it and you think, well, of course you're going to look for, why wouldn't you look for patterns? And yet it often takes an external observer such as yourself to come in and find those patterns. Is that because the organizations themselves are not looking for patterns, or is it because they're looking at the wrong, because they're going to be so many patterns? Is it about not being able to see the wood for trees, identifying the most important patterns?
Well, yes, all of the above. I mean, so now I'm going to have to tell you a story because I have a million stories.
I love stories. Tell me a story.
So years and years ago, when we still lived in Minneapolis, the one random weekend, it was a US holiday, our refrigerator just died. So we rushed around to get a new refrigerator, and my husband's friend was helping him move the refrigerator in. And he brought his kid with him, like a 4-year-old. And so my job was to kind of keep the kid entertained while they dealt with the refrigerator. Mm-hmm. My office at the time was right off the kitchen. Mm-hmm. And it had a door to the kitchen, and they somehow got the refrigerator wedged in the door. And just at that moment, the kid said, "I need to use the potty." So I'm looking at this 4-year-old, and I'm looking at the window and calculating the distance to the ground and wondering if I can lower him out the window and mm-hmm. then run around and bring him back in the other door and get him to the potty in time.
Yeah.
And he looks around and says, "Why are we thinking about the window? There's a door right there." And there was, yeah. But it was a door to the living room, and I got tired of people coming into my office that way. So I blocked it off with a bookcase. Right. So to me, its function as a door was completely gone. Yeah. But to this little kid who, mm-hmm. Didn't have that kind of history and that had become inured to it, it was obviously a door. And this same thing happens in organizations all the time. Mm. We just become so used to seeing something or not seeing something that we lose all consciousness of it. Mm. So, I think it's very easy for people not to see patterns. And people are, like I said, bombarded with events all the time. I mean, people, the pace of things happening is so intense in most organizations that people don't have time to step back and think. Mm-hmm. And sometimes they just don't recognize that a pattern is of significance. Mm-hmm. Like one organization I worked in, the very first day I was there, one of the senior vice presidents said, because he was upset that teams were not meeting their sprint commitments, he said, "Why aren't these teams accountable?" Mm-hmm. And I realized after I'd been there for a while was that was something that at every level managers talked about. Mm-hmm. Why aren't they accountable? Why aren't they accountable? Which would almost always be followed with, when I make a commitment, I follow through on it.
Yeah.
Right. So they were not aware of that was a pattern across all levels. Mm-hmm. And they were not aware of how difficult that made it for them to actually solve any of the problems in their organization.
Yeah. And was that sorry, carry on.
Yeah. So I just started asking different questions and say, well, who was in the room when the team committed to that? Mm-hmm. Oh, well, the team wasn't there. It was the program manager, and so I just asked different questions and it, tested a bunch of hypotheses. And eventually we figured out that the test environment was really an issue. Mm-hmm. And it was not, they had a particular bit of infrastructure that they all had to be working against, and it was not very available. You had to wait in line for it. And so the teams would take in a lot of extra work because they knew they were going to get stuck sooner or later. Yeah. And they didn't want to be slackers. They wanted to be working on something meaningful.
Yes.
So they took in all this stuff, which meant they didn't finish all this other stuff, but it actually masked the real problem. Mm-hmm. Right? Because as long as people were saying, why aren't they accountable? They were just focusing on the people rather than on the system, right? And people are easy to see and blame, and systems are harder to see. Yeah. Because we're taught to focus on people.
Yeah. Okay. So I wrote down two things actually. I wrote down data and blame. Blame is the one that I want to come back to because
Okay.
I saw a talk that you did on the topic of people and patterns, and you mentioned blame a few times, and you talked about how common it is for people to get in a situation where they will see problems and they will blame people for them rather than taking a step back and seeing patterns. And is that a really common thing, do you think, that people come
Oh,
to
for
that
sure.
conclusion?
For sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, people are easy to see, and patterns are harder to see. You have to be able to expand your temporal and spatial understanding of what's going on in the organization. It helps to, have some data to model it, or the luxury of time to just sit back and make notice of what you're observing, and see if there's something significant about it.
Yeah.
But I think business is just in some ways sort of wired towards blame. We have all of these promises that are made without necessarily a great understanding of the actual capacity of the organization. And then when the developers, often that's the case, can't meet the promise that was made by someone who didn't understand the capacity of the organization, rather than say, oh, oops, we overpromised. We better figure out how not to make these wild promises that we can't meet anymore. The blame gets pointed at the other person. And I think, essentially in some ways that happens when people feel afraid and vulnerable.
Yeah.
Right. Like, I'm afraid I'm going to lose my bonus. I'm afraid I'm going to not meet my target. I might get fired. So in some ways people try to protect themselves by projecting the issue onto someone else. And it very often comes from fear.
Yeah. And that in itself can be a pattern, can't it? If you see
Sure.
within an organization that
Sure.
several different individuals are being blamed for the same thing, so they keep complaining, in the example you gave, why are all of our people so bad at accountability? And if you see a pattern that you keep finding people apparently being blamed for the same thing, then, well, hang on a minute, is it really those individuals that are the problem, or is there something systemic that's causing this to appear to be a problem?
Yeah, like an organization I actually worked for when I was still an employee, they decided that the reason all their projects were late was because the project managers weren't accountable, because no one ever suffered consequences for a late project. So bad project managers. So one of the things they tried was saying, okay, from here forward, you will meet the original estimates plus or minus 5%, or no bonus for you, which, of course was ridiculous. It had nothing to do with it had little to do with the quality of the project managers. It had a lot to do with the fact that these were just really big software projects. And had they looked at the data, they would have realized that, in 10 years, one project had come in on time, and that was because it was tiny.
Yeah. And you also, when you start saying that kind of thing, no bonus if you don't fulfill this particular criteria, then you're encouraging people to game the system. So you're encouraging people to cut corners and do whatever they can to make the figures look right without actually addressing the issues themselves.
And that's exactly what happened.
Yeah. And something else that you just mentioned, you talked about temporal and spatial awareness, and it's something I've heard you talk about before, is how people are better at understanding spatial data than temporal data. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Well, that's partly why I draw so many diagrams when I'm working with people. I just sketch stuff for them, and I don't say, oh, I'm doing a container diagram, or I just start sketching stuff, because that makes it much easier for people to, one, see the pattern, see what might be going on, but it also means it's no longer, I'm trying to convince you of something, or we're, at odds about something. It's like, this thing is out there in front of us and we're both working on it. So I think people often, those things are more useful to look at visually. I also use that term in a different sense in terms of spatial being my part of the organization versus a distant part of the organization, or now time versus what happened in the past. Right.
Yeah. Fantastic. I love diagrams. I think making things visual, allowing people to see something is
well,
incredibly
it also
powerful.
externalizes it. It says this is a problem that's outside of us that we can work with, and I think that can diffuse a whole level of defensiveness.
So you're pointing at a diagram rather than a person. Yeah.
And you can be shoulder to shoulder looking at it. Usually, especially, if you can have it up on a wall, you're shoulder to shoulder looking at it. And, to some extent, that's replicated in things like Zoom, because we're actually shoulder to shoulder now, if you look at the picture.
Yeah. Okay, so time is marching on. So I'm going to move to the questions that I always ask every guest at the end. And hopefully you've had a bit of time to think about this. I'm going to ask you, if you can, to tell me one thing about you that's true and one thing that's untrue. And don't tell me which is which.
I roller skated backstage at a Patti Smith concert. And
brilliant.
I dye my hair.
Okay.
How do you think I get this perfect white color?
It is a wonderful color. It looks like bleach to me. Okay, so you're just going to have to tell me about roller skating backstage at a Patti Smith concert. This sounds like a good story if it happened.
You don't think that's the lie?
Well, you see, the thing is that most people, if they told me they'd roller skated backstage at a Patti Smith concert, I would say, no, you didn't. But Esther, somehow, I feel like this is something you could have done.
Yeah, well, it's true. This is my natural hair color. And I did that. I used to roller skate a lot.
Was it just because you just happened to be on roller skates because that was your preferred footwear at the time?
I don't actually remember why I had my roller skates with me, but I was backstage at a Patti Smith concert.
And were you just what we would call a ligger in the UK? So somebody
What's a litter?
A ligger with a G in the middle. Somebody who just wangled their way. Somebody who attends concerts but then wangles their way backstage just because they like to spend time.
I knew somebody who knew
people.
somebody. I knew somebody who's a friend of Patti Smith.
That's pretty cool. That in fact, that's very cool. Okay. And what is the best thing? In fact, because this is, sorry, I normally say the reason I ask this question is because I want to end on a high. So what is the best thing that's happened to you in the last month or so? It can be either work related or non-work related.
In the last month or so? Oh, can I go back a little further?
Yeah.
I got vaccinated against the coronavirus.
Mm-hmm.
So that is the best thing that's happened.
Have you had both doses?
Yes.
Wonderful. Yeah. That is very good. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay. Where can people find you?
Esther at estherderby.com. That's my email. My website is estherderby.com. I'm on Twitter at estherderby.com.
Fantastic.
I'm on LinkedIn at Esther Derby.
Brilliant.
Actually, Twitter is just Esther Derby.
Yeah.
I have a YouTube channel.
Wow.
You search on Esther Derby, you'll find two of us. It'll be obvious which one is me.
Okay. Do you have anything coming up that you'd like to plug?
Well, I do a series of webinars, every 3 months. I send out a different series of webinars on topics of interest to people who work with other humans. So you can find those on my website and sign up for them. They're informal, 45 minutes and then a Q&A, and they're a great way to interact with folks and share some stuff that helps with working with humans.
Brilliant. Okay. And are there any other people you can recommend that you think I should interview?
Oh, man. Well, is Jeepa on your list?
Yes, he is.
You already got just Can I come back to this question?
Yes, you can.
Of who else to interview?
Yeah, you can contact me at any time.
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you so much for speaking to me. The podcast isn't
Yeah.
over yet, but you can relax for a bit. There will be a Q&A session in a little bit. There might be questions for you in there, but for now you can chill. And thank you so much for talking to me. And thank you for joining our live podcast experiment. Okay,
yeah, it was a pleasure.
Oh, absolutely. It was a pleasure to talk to you. Okay, so it's time for story time. Every other episode, I tell a story. Storytelling is useful for teaching, for unlocking empathy, for creating a sense of connection and trust in teams. And I love telling stories. So I love telling stories to both children and adults. I'm a lapsed member of the UK Society for Storytelling. And I've been using stories in the podcast to illustrate various points about effective software development or sometimes effective teamwork. Okay, so 10 years ago, I was a high school maths teacher and I did my teaching practice in a school in Oldham, kind of northeast of Manchester. There was a lot of poverty, there was a lot of challenging behaviour from the children, but I wasn't exhausted and disillusioned yet at that point. I was still energetic, full of ideas. And in one of my classes, I had a Chinese pupil who was new to the country and didn't speak very much English. And if you can try and imagine what that might feel like, that would be a very overwhelming experience. You're spending a lot of time in lessons where you don't understand your fellow children, you don't understand everything the teachers are saying to you. It was difficult for him. I also had a friend and fellow student teacher, Xiao Chen, who was also Chinese, and she was also feeling the impact. Her English was very good. She'd been in England for quite a long time, but still the children didn't always understand her, and teaching is all about communication. So she was having a sometimes difficult time as well. And both of them, my friend and my pupil, spoke Mandarin. And I was thinking, what can I do to help my pupil? And I was thinking about empathy. I was thinking, is there anything I can do to teach the children what it feels like to be their fellow pupil and to teach them about seeing things from somebody else's point of view? And then, oh my God, I realized the answer was right in front of me. But I was a little bit worried. But I spoke to the school principal and the head of department and my mentor, and they were all excited too. I spoke to the pupil, he was on board with it. I spoke to Xiao Chen, she was well excited. Okay, so what was the plan? Well, it was all about empathy. It was like, what does it feel like to be surrounded by a foreign language all day? And what I decided to do was bring Xiao Chen into the school. She wasn't actually doing her teaching practice at this school, but everybody agreed that I could bring her in to teach a whole maths lesson in Chinese. Now, the thing is that maths is a universal language. So we had a big advantage that we were teaching maths and not English. Because it's a universal language, it wasn't difficult for us to find a topic that it would work. So we chose a topic with lots of diagrams, which was circle theorems. We also put a lot of effort into making sure that it was a safe environment. So we spoke very closely with the pupil, made sure that he was absolutely on board with it, and that we could make sure that he had get out clauses. He could let us know if it wasn't safe for him, if he wasn't enjoying it. And what we did was we gave them all a crib sheet, which I actually have stuck to the wall in my study as a memento, because I was so keen on all of this. You probably won't be able to see the details, but it's a little crib sheet, and there are about 15 phrases on it that we thought we would use during the lesson with their translations using the Chinese symbols. And nobody was allowed to speak a word of English. They all had to use the diagrams, use the crib sheet that they were given, and find other ways of communicating. So it was a little bit worrying. It was a little bit nerve-wracking when we finally got to the day of the lesson. And I had quite a crowd at the back of the classroom as well. I had the head teacher and my mentor and the head of department, a bunch of other teachers who'd just come along for the show. I was quite scared. I was worried, what if the kids had no idea what was going on? What if they didn't play along? And the thing about kids is when they're bored and when they're frustrated, that's when their behavior starts to deteriorate. And I was really quite worried that they might poke fun, that they might not, engage with it. And also as a result that it would be distressing for the Chinese pupil. And out of all the languages we might have done this in, Chinese is probably one of the languages this is furthest from English. I certainly am not able to even guess at what somebody is saying when they're speaking in Chinese, whereas with a lot of other languages I can, because there are similarities and connections. And I've got such a clear memory of Xiao Chen standing at the front of the classroom. I did not have the faintest clue what she was saying, except that I did, because of the diagrams that she'd drawn and because of the pointing and because of her intonation. And then not long after the lesson had started, she asked a question of the whole class in Chinese, and the class was silent. And this was the crunch point. This was, oh no, what's going to happen now? And nothing happened. And I was quite worried. And then one hand went up, and then another, and then another. And like about 10 children put their hands up and were able to answer the question that she'd asked by pointing. It was absolutely wonderful. And the whole lesson went on well from there. The kids loved it. I loved it. The school leadership loved it. The Chinese people loved it. Xiao Chen loved it. It was wonderful. But what did we learn? And I think there's quite a few things that you can learn from that. I think one of them is that creativity captures imaginations, that if you can think of different ways of approaching problems, that it can really make a difference, and allowing people to be creative, not always doing things the same way. And that empathy is clearly important, but sometimes it requires demonstration for people to actually know what it feels like, to actually try and create a situation where they can feel it. And that it's always worth paying attention to people who might be excluded and thinking about how you can bring those people in. And when people are different, find ways for them to take control and celebrate those differences rather than trying to eradicate the differences. Celebrate diversity, because it's wonderful to see other ways of experiencing things. Okay, how are we doing for time? We're doing pretty well, actually. So before we go, because we specialize in working with the not-for-profit sector, in Made Tech, we really care about making the world a better place. So in every podcast episode, I just come up with or ask people for short suggestions of how we can make life better. And today I'm going to use another one from this book that I've used a couple of times before. It's called Change the World for a Fiver. And it was recommended to me by my colleague, Adam Friday. And this one says, spend time with someone from a different generation. And I'm going to attempt to show the picture. What you might be able to see is that there's two people side by side. One of them is older and one of them is younger. And the older person has on their T-shirt, talk to young people. They know cool stuff you don't. And the young person has on their T-shirt, talk to old people. They know cool stuff you don't. So I like that one. I think it's a really nice little thing. Remember to spend time with people of different generations. Okay, so we've reached the end of another episode. I've got a few talks coming up that I'm doing. If you look at my events page on my Medium blog, which is linked to from my Twitter profile, all the details are there. You can find me on Twitter at Clare Sudbery, which might not be spelt the way that you think. There is no I in Clare, and Sudbery is spelt the same way as surgery, with an E-R-Y at the end. You can find the podcast on Twitter at Making Tech Bet 2. That's making, and then tech is TECH, and then the first bit of bet, because Twitter wouldn't give us the handle we wanted, so BETT, and then just a number 2 on the end. Come and say hello, give us feedback, give us contributions, give us suggestions for making life better, or just have a chat with us. Thank you to Rose, who is our editor and will be editing this episode, but hopefully there will be slightly less work this time than there has been on previous ones, because most of what I wanted to say, I have said. Thank you also to Kat Arney, who runs First Create the Media and is the host of the very successful Genetics Unzipped podcast. When we started making this podcast, none of us had ever made a podcast before, and her expertise and advice has been absolutely invaluable. I'll put a link in the description for the episode. Thanks also to Richard Murray, who made the music. Oh, I might have forgotten some of no, that's okay. There's more music coming. Also in the description, there'll be a link to subscribe to our newsletter. We're making new episodes every fortnight. Thank you for listening, and hang on a minute, let me say that again. Thank you for listening, and goodbye.
Lovely stuff. And with that, are you happy to go into our Q&A for the evening?
Yep.
Lovely stuff. So the first question, let me just get this up and running, as well as bring my face back to, there we go. The first question is, what has been your favorite part about putting together the podcast?
Well, I mean, that's really easy, actually. Just being able to speak to all these different people. So, I mean, just being able to have all of these different conversations with so many different people who are such interesting people. And it's made me realize that because I'm now hosting a podcast, I can just ask anybody to come and talk to me. I mean, they might not say yes, but anybody who I think would be interesting to talk to, I can ask them to come and talk to me, which is like, wow.
Lovely stuff. Next question is, how do you choose who to invite to the show?
Well, so what I'm looking for is, I mean, we have a theme. The theme is improving software delivery. It's a deliberately broad theme because we're going to be releasing episodes every fortnight. That's 26 episodes a year, and I hope we'll be going for several years. So I want to keep having things to talk about. So it's finding people who I think are eloquent, who have something interesting to say on the topic of improving software delivery, who have things to say that our listeners will be able to learn from. So it's actually worth them listening and giving up some of their time in order to listen. And I have to confess that on a purely cynical basis, we do look for people who are high profile so that they can help to spread the word about the podcast. That's not a hard and fast rule, but it is also one of the things that we look at when we're thinking of people. But one of the things we're still thinking about is trying to get the balance right between technical content, as in stuff that's, that's about the nuts and bolts of code and software engineering, and stuff that's more people focused or process focused, getting that balance right. So I'm looking ahead at people I want to invite, and I'm thinking, are the topics a good balance of topics, that it's not all skewed in one particular area or another? And absolutely very interested in any recommendations that people have of people who might be good to have as guests.
Wonderful stuff. I think that is all the questions we have logged in for the evening. So with that, I'm just going to say a massive thank you to you, Claire, for hosting another wonderful episode. And thank you very much, Esther, for joining us. As promised, we're going to share a little bit of information about what we have coming up here at MadeTech. Our next event is taking place next week as a part of GovX. Our head of local government, Glenn Ochcore, will be speaking on the Future of Local Government Services panel, taking place on the 12th of May at 8:30 a.m. Glenn will be speaking alongside Tarek Khan, the Chief Digital Information Officer at the London Borough of Camden, Dr. Deborah Smart, Corporate Director for Digital and Change at Dorset Council, and Sandra Taylor, the Assistant Director of IT and Digital at Worcestershire County Council. The very next day, our Chief Technology Officer, Luke Morton, will be speaking on the Accelerating Delivery panel. That's on the Thursday, the 13th of May from 3:30 p.m. Luke will be speaking alongside Anthony Collard, the Director of Strategy, Design, Architecture and Innovation at HMRC, Dan West, the Chief Digital Information Officer at the Department of Health in Northern Ireland, Rachel Nixon, the Deputy Director of Digital Project Delivery at the Department for Transport, and Daniel Wintercross, the Product Director for the Department of Health and Social Care. Now, if you have any more questions for Claire about the podcast or anything MadeTech, please do reach out. Claire's Twitter handle is up there on the screen now. Or if you want to keep up to date with all things MadeTech, our website is up on the screen as well as our Twitter handle. Please do reach out to us. We love a chat. And as promised, I will be sharing information on how you can access the after party, which will be starting around 8 o'clock and going on until about 9.
I have a suggestion about that, Jack. Sorry to interrupt. Because we've actually finished slightly earlier than we thought we would by about 10 minutes. And we were going to propose a break for people to go away and, get themselves food and drink and whatever. But maybe we could start the after party at 10 to 8 instead of 8. So that gives people a 15-minute break. Because there's no reason why not, is there?
No, there's no reason at all. One moment. I can just open up the chat. And I can stop sharing my screen. I'm going to share the link on how to access the, sorry, one moment, if my screen will allow me to. One moment. Lovely stuff. There's the chat. I'm adding the link to attend. It's done on a website called WonderMe. It is all browser based, no downloads required. All you have to do is click on the link that I've just added to the chat for all panelists and attendees, and you should be able to enter the room straight away. So let's all reconvene. If you go grab a drink, go to the loo, do whatever you need to do, and we'll see you all very shortly for the after party of our launch. So once again, thank you, Esther, for coming and speaking to us, and thank you to all of our attendees for making the time to be here today.
Thanks,
And with
Jack.
that, thank you very much.